Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Good evening. I know most of you. I am David Rosenblum. I am the director of the International Tax Program, and this is our 23rd in a series of Tillinghast lectures. I see a lot of alums in the audience, so you've been to this before. We begin on a bit of a sad note. I think most of you know that just about a month ago, a little bit more than a month ago, David Tillinghast passed away. He was a great inspiration for us in the law school. The Tillinghast Lecture was named after him before I came here, but much more broadly, he was just a giant figure in international tax in the United States. He was the first person to hold the position of effectively International Tax Counsel in the Treasury. He was instrumental in negotiating a number of major treaties, including one with Germany, and we will really miss him. He is he was a good friend. He was very helpful to me. He was very helpful to many people. He's a great mentor and a fine gentleman. So in any event, passing to today's event, we have a very interesting and distinguished speaker. It is Edward Throop from the United Kingdom. Edward is a longtime friend of mine whom I met many years ago when he was in private practice in a law firm in London. He's had a very interesting career, having worked not only in private practice but in tax policy for the UK government, for the Minister of Finance, and also most recently having finished his career as the executive chair of HMRC. So he's had experience not only in private practice, but in tax policy at a very high level in the UK, and also in tax administration. And I think he's going to tell us about a number of those things today. We had a wonderful lunch today with the International Tax Program students, and we got a little taste of what he's going to say. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the lectern over to Edward, and at the end of his conclusion of his remarks, I'll come up and ask for a few questions, if any. Edward.
David, it's a real pleasure to be here and very good to see you again after rather too many years. I knew David Tillinghast. I worked on the International Fiscal Association, IFA, and was on the executive committee there until I joined the Treasury in 2004. And he was a giant of man. He was a big man, but he was also a man who was big in tax, and he could be quite intimidating for the younger lawyers and participating, because David had strong and almost invariably good and right views about things. So it is sad that he's not with us, but I'm absolutely delighted to be giving this lecture with his name attached in the 23rd year. I've given this. Actually, the title, as you'll see on the slides, I've got a few slides which are more to keep me on track than for you to read, and you probably won't be able to read them at the back anyway. I've given this talk a slightly longer title on the slides here than on the programme, because I wanted to put in the word opportunity, because the title as marketed with apocalypse made it sound as though I thought the end of the world was nigh, and this evening is very much an opportunity for me to bring together my experience, which, as David has said, I've been extraordinarily fortunate to work both as a practitioner to work in tax policy for government, but also to work in tax administration. So I have seen all of the aspects, all of the sides of the tax systems of at least one country, and I apologise if my talks are somewhat Anglo or British centric, but I have seen, I hope, enough of some other tax systems to make what I say relevant to all of us. The title is quite provocative. This is a time of quite a lot going on, and I don't just mean today in the Senate hearings. There is a lot going on in the world. And there is a lot going on with world tax systems. And the first point I would make, particularly to an audience, of lawyers and alumni and others in the program which David runs, is that the word tax systems. I mean, tax is a system, and my experience has been to demonstrate quite how much of an integrated system tax is between the law which you study, the impact that has on taxpayers, the importance that tax has for government, but also the role of tax administration. And as you will see, I will talk separately but together about tax administration and tax policy, because the two of them together do actually make the tax systems. So if I have a theme, as I say, it is to look at the changing world order, to talk a little bit about what tax systems are, and as the players in the systems, to look at the relationship between taxpayer and government, and how the three themes which I've put up on the title are impacting, and what's going on there are impacting on all of that. So I'm going to start, having sort of effectively implied that we live in a time of change, to say a little bit about what I have slightly boldly called the changing world order. Now, I suspect at the back you won't be able to read this. And I only put this up really to remind you, one always thinks one lives in times of change, but I do think that at the moment, certainly from where I sit and having been through various aspects of tax, as I say, there is a lot going on which impacts much more widely than just the narrow issue of law. And so I will run through these very quickly. Democratic and macroeconomic change, demographic and macroeconomic change. I mean, the first and obvious point is that tax is here for one overriding purpose, which is to fund public services. We have, during our lifetimes, seen huge growth in the world economy. We've seen huge growth in the demand for public services, and with it, a demand for taxation. So the first obvious point is that the demand for tax is getting greater at a rate which is quite considerable. And for this audience, looking at international tax, while the tax take in the developed countries has remained relatively static over the last 20 or 30 years, the ambition of all of the developing countries of the world, of course, is to increase their tax take by some measure. We've also seen a dramatic move, or a dramatic shift from of the economics of activity more towards service-based output, which itself has challenges, as we'll see. The second category I've put down is commercial and technological change. Globalization, which I'm not going to, at this point, say much about, because in a sense you have your own views of what it is, and indeed the subject you are working in reflects the impacts of globalization on tax systems. And digital and technology. And again, I'll come back when I talk a little bit about the impact on tax administration and tax policy as to what that actually means. But I've listed, and you definitely won't be able to, and I can't even read on my own notes what I've listed here, that first of all, that digital and technology give you opportunities to create value in new ways. They dematerialize an awful lot of value creation, which is obviously challenging for tax systems. They give you opportunities to do things with data at a speed and a volume which is completely unprecedented, and gives the opportunity for data to be shared either systematically or chaotically, all of which challenge tax systems. And then last, and in a sense broadest, and I'm not a political scientist or a sociologist, but you only have to observe what's going on in an awful lot of countries. There is huge political and social change, decision-making by social media, the rise of populism, nationalism, the disintegration of states, the end of multilateralism, and most particular for this subject, as you'll see I'll come back to, the loss of confidence in governments, in institutions, and most worryingly, in the rule of law. It's a long list, but in a sense, I'm here not to tell you what's going on, but to encourage you to think about what's going on in the world and how it impacts on the subject which you are studying or are practicing. Before I get on and talk about tax administration and tax policy, I was going to make some broad points about tax and about the tensions which go into the system. And I've headed this law, politics and nationhood because there are, running through tax systems, three tensions, or in some ways paradoxes. The first of them is the relationship between law and what I would call equity or fairness. I've got a little phrase here, legalized extortion. Now, if you've been sad enough to look at my entry up on Wikipedia, you will see this phrase appears. I wrote for the Financial Times a number of articles before I went into public practice, and one of them was about the possible introduction of a general anti-avoidance rule, a GAR in the UK, something which my views have shifted on over the years. But the essential point which I was making, which emerged in the perhaps not particularly well chosen phrase, but it's one I'm not going to resolve. I'm going to double down, I think is the phrase these days, on the use of the phrase legalized extortion, is the intrinsic point in law, in tax, that tax is effectively a creature of law. It is a creature which depends for its effectiveness on the legal structures of the system of laws, the constitution in which it is based. And yet what it seeks to do is to deprive the citizen of private property. And so you have the contradiction at the heart of tax, that it operates strictly and absolutely under the rule of law, but what it seeks to do is to extract from the private citizen for no compensation or no direct compensation his or her private property. And precisely because it is this, if not unequal bargain, this slightly odd bargain, there is no equity about a tax, and that I hope you recognise is a quote from a UK case. There is no tax equity about a tax. But tax is pure law in that sense. But the paradox and the tension here is that it may be pure law, but unless it is regarded as fair, unless it is regarded as equitable by the citizenship at large, it will not stand. And there are any number of examples of taxes which have been passed through good and due process and law and have then failed to work simply because of their perception of lack of fairness and the revolt against them by the electorate, by the taxpayers. And that leads on to the second point and the second tension about tax, that it is pure law, it is the legal subject par excellence, but it is also raw politics. And the prerogative of government is to tax and to raise money for the purposes of the state. So the second tension, which is intrinsic in any tax system, is that while it is pure law, if you don't understand and take into account the political dynamics of tax, again, the tax will fail. And the third point, which flows from that, is precisely because tax is such a political activity, it is a very national activity. It has to be linked to a national system. And as a result, with one or two rather notable exceptions, there are no international taxes, although taxes themselves operate internationally. So you have there on that screen three tensions or paradoxes which for all tax systems to continue to operate need to be kept in balance. The fact that tax has to operate within the law as the law, but must be seen to operate fairly. That it does operate as a legal construct, but it has to operate absolutely within the political context of the national political system. And because it operates as within a national political system, there are effectively no international taxes. Now, of course, every rule has an exception. We are in the UK, as you know, in the course of Brexit, or trying to exit the European Union against the better judgment of most people who actually know anything about it, but it's what we've decided to do. And one of the biggest issues, if you do follow Brexit, is whether we are or are not within the customs union. And the customs union is a system introduced by, adopted by the European Parliament to apply effectively one of the few major international taxes in the world, which is the common system of tariffs charging customs duty on all imports of goods into the European Union. And it is somewhat ironic that actually this is the issue, or the first issue, and certainly the most important issue when it comes to my former department, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, which has caused most trouble in the early stages of Brexit, although there are many other significant problems with Brexit. So those 3 points and those 3 tensions between tax and fairness, tax and politics, and the national nature of the national basis of taxes and the international nature of activities are 3 tensions which have to be kept in balance. And it's easy to see tax systems as in a steady state, but actually at any one time these tensions are there. So that's the underlying framework for tax systems. The other relationship and tension which supports tax systems is the relationship between the taxpayer and government. And at this point, and I can never have a slide presentation which doesn't have a few pictures in, particularly when they're historical ones. I've got a little bit of history which sets up where we've got to on the relationship between taxpayer and government. Now, I apologise to about 3/4 of the audience that these are 4 dead white men, but you know what history's like. That's sort of how history is. And they're all 4 dead white men who lived, as if you recognise any of them, and you probably recognise their costume, in the latter half of the 18th century. But this is, I promise you, not a digression. This is the period of history where effectively the relationship between taxpayer and government was established. And it's worth just running through to look at all 4 of these to understand what that relationship is. And again, when we come on and look at what's going on in the world today, to see how much the basis of that relationship is changed. So starting at the top left, and I'm not going to test you, but I hope within the audience, all of you, someone will recognise all of these 4 gentlemen. Top left is Samuel Johnson, whose dictionary, you know, is actually a terrific good read. There's a nice potted version of the more entertaining quotes which you can find online. And Samuel Johnson defined excise as a hateful tax adjudged not by the common judges of property, but by wretches hired by those to whom the tax is paid. Now, apart from being wonderful English prose, because Johnson was very good at that, and reflecting something of an enduring attitude of taxpayer to government, there is actually within the point he is making there a rather important one. Because what he says is, it's adjudged not by the common judges of property, by wretches, but by wretches hired by those to whom the tax is paid. And the point he's actually making is not that this is just a bad tax in itself, and actually he's not passing judgment on whether it's a bad or good tax in itself, but about the method by which it is effectively collected. And he's objecting to the fact that it's adjudged, effectively the final determination of the liability of the tax is not by some independent tribunal, the common judges of property, but the wretches to whom the tax is paid. So effectively, Revenue and Customs were themselves making the determination from whom there was no appeal. And that is interesting, because what you see there, and in a sense this is the theme of the 18th century, is the empowerment of the individual, the sense of fairness, and the necessity for the tax to be a good tax, that effectively it has the confidence of the taxpayer, and that the system under which it is collected, and in this case adjudged, is one which is seen as fair. So you have got a concept which comes up time and time again, which is the confidence of the citizen in the process by which tax is paid. And you would not have seen anything like that written 50 or 100 years earlier. The second on the right, again, I hope you recognise, actually writing only 20 years later, is Adam Smith, and Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. And if you haven't read the wonderfully written and fairly brief passages, well, they're quite lengthy, but the pieces on the 4 canons of taxation are well worth revisiting. I haven't got them here, but Adam Smith sets out what he sees as the 4 canons of good taxation, which you can sort of see as being fairness, certainty, efficiency, and simplicity. It's put at slightly more length than that, but those are the points. And again, you see this degree of objectivity about the fairness of the tax, the efficiency of the tax, the effectiveness of the tax being brought in. The third gentleman I really hope you recognise, bottom left, is Thomas Paine, about whom not much needs to be said, because of course the point I made on the previous slide about the political nature of tax, the national nature of tax, and Tom Paine and Rights of Man, of course, is why you're sitting here, and this is an American flag and on a Union Jack behind me. And the last of them, Louis XVI, in the bottom right-hand corner, lost his head. There are many causes of the French Revolution, but one of the most proximate causes was that Louis XVI funded himself, as governments so often do, by borrowing from Dutch bankers who lent to him on the strength of the fact that he could raise tax. And in whichever couple of years before the revolution, I can't remember whether it was 86 or 87, the Dutch bankers effectively lost confidence in his ability to raise tax, and they withdrew funding, and it all went downhill after that. So there are some quite important themes on this slide about the confidence of the taxpayer in the administration, in the government, in the tax-raising machinery, the confidence of external parties, Louis XVI's bankers, in the government's ability to pay tax, and the fairness and integrity with which the system operates. And what you see during this period of 100 years is the shift of the government from sovereign and ruler to servant of the people, and of course the shift of the taxpayer from subject to citizen. And particularly within Johnson's definition, you see how that has shaped the model of tax collection, which in itself enables and determines the scope and shape of policy. So these changes in the 18th century effectively established the relationship which is implicit and often explicit in your clients if you're advising taxpayers, and in governments in the relationship between taxpayer and between subject and citizen. The shift from subject to citizen and the relationship between the citizen and the state, which comes on to, unashamedly, onto the question of tax administration, because I would start with tax administration as effectively being the machinery which has to be in place and working effectively before governments can adopt and impose tax policy. This is my second and only other picture. And again, I've headed this tax collection from enforcement to compliance. What we have here on the left is William Pitt imposing income tax on the British citizen personified by John Bull. Now, there are a number of points to be made here, some of which I will not digress on. The first point is you always need a good war to impose a new tax. And William Pitt was Prime Minister during the wars with Napoleon, and income tax was introduced in 1799 in order to fund the necessary defence spending. The much more important point, which you absolutely cannot read, is that you will see behind John Bull's head there's a poster on the wall. And the poster on the wall is headed a schedule for the computation of profits. And you might possibly be able to see there are 2 columns in it. And those 2 columns effectively show income and expenses. The point about this and about this slide and about what effectively it marks in the shift in the relationship between taxpayer and government is that William Pitt and his, whatever this beast is, who is in full backing up his enforcement, are relying not on the ability to go in and just collect the tax. They're relying on the taxpayer actually preparing and submitting a return. And so the shift that has happened here, and the shift that was both necessary and empowering to governments from income tax, was the shift on the responsibility for the provision of information and the making of returns to the citizen. It was no longer a matter of stopping the ship at the dock and counting the number of barrels of beer or whatever it was and taking an appropriate payment. There was a requirement on the citizen to submit, in this case, his schedule of income and expenses and to pay tax accordingly. The other interesting point about this is it is headed a schedule, and that's a reflection of the Taxes Act, the Tax Act of 1799, which set out the requirement on the taxpayer to submit his returns according to a number of schedules. So Schedule A was the return, I think, from farming. Schedule B was the return from woodlands. Schedule C from government bonds, and so on. And the reason that there were separate schedules to the Tax Act in 1799 was because it was not felt appropriate that the taxpayer should submit a return of the totality of his affairs, and it would be his because women were not individual taxpayers at that point, his affairs to a single government official because of fear of disclosing all of his affairs and government becoming aware of the totality of any individual's affairs. And so there's an intrinsic, implicit respect here for the privacy of the individual and for the confidentiality of the information which the taxpayer provides. And so we have here effectively the basis of modern tax collection and modern tax administration. We have effectively the reliance on the one hand of the government on the taxpayer to submit and prepare a return, to require information to be submitted by a taxpayer. But we also have a respect by government for the rights and the confidentiality of the taxpayer and the privacy of his affairs. And again, a sense of the need to demonstrate fairness and fair dealings between taxpayer and citizen. Now, I've spent a little bit of time on those two slides, really to remind you that this relationship between subject and tax and government, between citizen and state, is not a fixed one, although this model has effectively determined the shape of tax collecting for the last 200 years. Which brings us, leaping over 200 years of world history, to today. And these are just little extracts from the mission statements, or whatever you like to call them, of the UK Tax Administration and of the IRS. And again, you may or may not be able to read them. The relevant words are that the HMRC says we help the honest majority get their tax right. The IRS says we provide good quality service by helping taxpayers understand and meet their tax responsibilities. And there is here an implicit bargain between taxpayer and tax administration, whereby the deal is we will help you get it right, backed up by some sort of implicit threat of enforcement, but we expect you to help us comply. And so we have a model of high reliance on voluntary compliance, dependent on good service provided by the tax administration and public confidence in the tax administration, which is backed by selective enforcement activities. And most importantly, it requires information. It requires that information which William Pitt required from the schedule of income tax in 1799. So that model of tax administration has stood for 200 years. As I say, I don't think that William Pitt's tax collectors probably had a mission statement, but they probably thought about it in much the same way. And look, it works, more or less. These are just some random countries taken from the OECD stats. This is a lot of money. We are collecting, tax administrations of the world, trillions and trillions of dollars. These figures are all in billions of US dollars. There's obviously some significant variation in the right-hand column of what percentage of GDP, but that largely reflects political choice. We have a model of tax administration which has stood for 200 years. It is dependent on the right balance of the three elements which I mentioned at the beginning, between the tax law and fairness, between law and politics, and a reliance on nationhood. But it's above all dependent on compliant citizens, and those citizens are compliant only so long as they have confidence in the system to which they are having to pay tax, as Louis XVI discovered to his cost. So we've got what appears to be a stable system, or at least we have a system which appears to work, and we have a system which has stood the test of at least 200 years, raising income tax from compliant citizens backed up by enforcement. But as you saw from my first slide on the changing world order, an awful lot is going on. Now, if I'd been standing here a year ago in my role as Chair of Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, I'd have put up a slide which probably would have had content which was rather like this. I'd have said, sorry, I don't know how much you can read, but I will go through this. I'd say that the tax administration of the future has to be digital and data-driven. We have to provide digital service. Every citizen taxpayer has to be able to access his or her tax affairs digitally at any time or any place. We will want to collect from you taxpayer data in an effective electronic way, preferably getting it in real time. And we rely for the information that we need in order to assess you properly and find out whether you've paid the right tax on all sorts of other data sources. So we will collect data from businesses, from financial and other intermediaries, and we will use opportunistic data sources like the Panama Papers and the other papers to make things, to make sure we have the information that we know. And we will back that up with really good data analytics, artificial intelligence in order to tailor our service, make ourselves as effective as possible, and we'll collaborate internationally. And that, in a sense, is the, I won't say standard, but if you talk to any tax commissioner from around the developed world, actually, and from around the world, they all give you a story like that. They'd say we're not sitting back, we're not complacent, and there is a rosy future ahead. Tax administrations are going to be even more effective and efficient. So, coming back to my question, are the changes, globalization, technology, and individualism, a threat or an opportunity to tax systems? I would say there are some issues here. And I'll tell you whether I'm sort of half glass half full or glass half empty on this. But when you look at some of the ambitions, there's quite a lot going on. First of all, in the digital services, I don't know what the record's like in the US. Actually, the UK record's not too bad, but delivering any government IT project is always a little bit on the challenging side, even if you get the money in the first place. More seriously, are we really ready, particularly in that world which William Pitt was worried about, of confidentiality? Are we really comfortable that digital service of tax administrations are robust against those bad guys out there? It was always said in HMRC that someone somewhere in the organisation could, lead to the senior leadership being sacked at any moment, and the people who were most able to do that were almost certainly in our IT department, because if we lose the data which we hold, we would be in big trouble. So digital service, actually it is working, but there are a lot of vulnerabilities. Tax administration is absolutely dependent on information, and that was William Pitt's point in his schedules. But this itself is vulnerable to technological challenges simply through the ability to conceal information in almost any part of the world. But more seriously, and this I think is a lesson for all of us, that the public acceptance of the free and liberal provision of data and information to tax administrations does have bounds, particularly in the more, I would say, democratic world. I saw a demonstration last year, in fact, just about this time last year, the Russian VAT system, which is absolutely fabulous from a tax administration's point of view. They could put up a screen in front of you, effectively information which would drill down from real-time VAT receipts down through to individual taxpayers, to individual invoices. So it was possible to call up on the screen the invoice for the sale of sturgeon in some, minor Russian town by some fishmonger, and a copy of the VAT invoice which had been issued 15 minutes earlier. And I saw this working in real time, which from a tax administration's perspective is absolutely fabulous. In the UK, there was an attempt some 5 or 6 years ago to take all the existing information or health data held in fragmented systems all around the clinics of the UK and put it onto one system in order to be able to get more information about the hotspots for particular issues in the country, like heart disease or diabetes or whatever it was, and to target responses. That, leaving aside the technological issues with that, and the program for that itself ran several years late, it was eventually pulled simply because the public were not happy to see their data brought together on a single system. So while we have these ambitions for effective and real-time taxpayer data collection, resistance from the public can be quite significant. Similarly, some of the things that we want to do with additional data sources are incredibly exciting. It would be superb for the tax administrations of the world, and indeed for the businesses, if all of the intermediary businesses, the Ubers, the Airbnbs, the Amazons and the eBays, would provide the information on all sales and transactions in a consistent format to all tax administrations in order to be able to match up those people who are selling and those people who had the wherewithal to buy against taxpayer data. We are a very long way from that, not just because of public acceptability, but because of the difficulties of coordinating across countries to achieve the level of consistency of approach which that requires. Similarly, there are great things that can be done on data analytics and AI, but I only have to sort of mention sort of recent issues with Cambridge Analytica, and 3 or 4 years ago, the issues the IRS here had, where you lost a commissioner because of what was alleged to be targeting of taxpayers by reference to whether or not they had an affiliation to the Tea Party, to understand that as soon as we start using behavioural and linking understanding of taxpayers with factors other than pure tax information, we run into very, very dangerous territory. And finally, and most important, given that we are working in national institutions, but with international businesses and transactions, international collaboration is extraordinarily hard. But as we were discussing with David over lunch, it is an amazing achievement of the OECD with, in a sense, no legal status at all has managed to achieve as much coordination as it has. And the weakening that we are seeing of international institutions, and indeed the competition for tax revenues, means that the obvious things that tax administrations would like to do are increasingly running into resistance, both at national and at individual levels. Coordinating international activities is getting a lot harder, not easier, although I hope this week's progress in the United Nations may, do something about that. So, in answer to my question, and seeing tax systems as a combination of the tax administrations and tax policy, where do I think we stand on tax administrations? I do think that there are significant opportunities for what we can do with digital and data, and quietly, tax administrations are getting on with it. Technology is a fabulous tool. Tax administrations are hampered by resource constraints around the world, but there are some great things going on. And as I say, I won't say regrettably, it's in those countries where actually the voice of the people is probably slightly less dominant, where some of the greatest progress has been made. So the Chinese and the Russians are doing fantastic things, and things which I do not regard as anyway inconsistent with democratic institutions, but would be much more difficult to do here. The technical solutions are risky, potentially vulnerable, and require public support. The dependence on tax collection on public confidence is being tested, because one of the themes of the challenges for tax administrations is the extent to which we do need the public, tax administrations do need the public with them. And all of the changes, all of the things we'd like to do, and a lot of what's going on in the world are testing that confidence. And, as I've said, the practical effectiveness of domestic collection, and indeed the confidence in domestic collection, is very much dependent on international coordination. And as I've said, international and domestic institutions are under strain. So, am I glass half full? Yes, I am. I'm about 3/5 full on tax administrations. I do believe that immense progress, considerable progress is being made by tax administrations, but against some very tough headwinds. And beyond the technical headwinds, I would pick out of that list the two issues of confidence in the system overall, and respect for the international and the use of the international institutions, and recognition of the need for international cooperation to make these things work. But, as I say, tax is still being collected, and my previous slide I showed how much tax was being collected. So we could stop there and say it's all fine, there are a few challenges, but public servants always complain that it's all very difficult, but it's all right. But is it all fine in terms of outcome? Because I gave you a great list of how much tax is being collected, trillions of being collected. If I was standing here, in front of a law enforcement audience as the recently retired police chief of wherever, I wouldn't be saying how well I'd been doing because 30 million households in the UK hadn't committed murder in the last year. I'd be telling you, how few people, had committed serious crimes, and I'd be showing you the falling crime rate, and hence demonstrating what a high proportion of the population were law-abiding. Tax administrations are remarkably coy in putting forward equivalent figures. And I apologise for the fact that I actually come from the only tax administration in the world that does, on an annual basis, publish its failure rate. And our failure rate is 5.7%. That is the tax gap in the UK. It's actually lower than it's ever been. And again, just not going on too much about what a fantastic job we've been doing. The IMF have been told us this is a great methodology, and our figures are very robust. We've done it on an annual basis now for some 2005, I think we started doing it on a whole tax basis. So, it's quite good. We think, we're sort of 94% successful. Only 6% of people break the law. Which, depends which way you look at it, but I've always said to my colleagues that the real measure of our success is not how much tax is collected, because, any fool can collect tax if governments put tax rates up. What the real measure of the success of a tax administration and hence the effectiveness of the system is how much tax is not collected. The figure on the left, which you may be delighted to know you can't read because it's slightly embarrassing, taken from the IRS's most recent annual report, shows that that of 2.5 trillion owed by taxpayers, 2 trillion was collected and 450 billion was not collected. The very, very small print, which you definitely can't read, says that these are figures for 2010-11, which are the most recent figures, unless somebody in the audience can tell me otherwise, that the IRS has actually collected and published these figures. I'm sorry, I can't, mince words here. I think that's shocking. I think for the largest, most powerful economy in the world, for 20% of tax not to be collected is an extraordinary figure. I don't know how we've managed to get it to 5.7%, and I certainly wouldn't be complacent about it. I don't think you're out of line with the tax gap in other countries, because very few countries do publish their tax gap. And I'd also say about our tax gap, there's an interesting sort of structural point here, that although our overall tax gap is 5.7%, that's largely because so much of our tax is collected at source under pay-as-you-earn, and actually the tax gap for the self-assessed taxpayers in the UK is about 20%. So there's a quite deep message here about the structure of tax collection and the impact on the tax gap. But the overriding point here is that, would you buy shares in any organisation which was only capable of collecting 94% of its debts? Would you buy shares in any organisation which was only capable of collecting 80% of its debts? You certainly have some questions to ask of the management. So, while I can paint a rosy picture of the future and say that all of the threats are, not that bad, actually, when you look at what's going on in tax administrations, you do start to worry. And I'm sorry, I'm not sorry. I don't apologise for picking these two examples because they're quite interesting. But you do start to worry whether something is wrong with tax administration. My good friend John Koskinen, the recently retired Commissioner of the IRS, would tell you that the funding of the IRS is one of the most arbitrary and irritating things he had to cope with in what was quite an irritating time as Commissioner for him. Great man, lovely man. I simply don't know how he did it. The other interesting thing about our figures, which comes back to my theme of confidence, is that you show this to the British people, and they say, that's just a made-up figure. They'd say, big businesses aren't paying nearly enough tax, and you say you're collecting, and I think we say the tax gap for large businesses is about 2%. You say you're collecting 98% of tax due to large business. Well, large businesses are just getting away with it, and why should I pay my tax when they're not? So there's an interesting point here about how this all plays into policy, and whether, while these tax gap figures are interesting, and I will pass on quickly from them to save any more embarrassment, while actually this is a good segue into the question of where tax policy stands and how much of this reflects both policy as how the collection works, but also the underlying tax policy. So you'll remember from my previous slide that I gave figures for several countries. I've decomposed, again, just for the sake of comparison, effectively what tax policy is achieving in our two countries. Can you see those numbers, actually? Because I don't want to have to read them all out. Can you sort of roughly see those numbers at the back? Yeah. Sort of. Okay. I mean, the interesting thing about this, and this is to sort of lead into what I want to say about how tax policy is challenged, is that actually these figures are remarkably similar. We think that actually, our tax systems are somewhat different. But actually, and these figures are percentage of GDP raised in tax. And while there's a clear policy choice in the US about the structure of tax, and that's reflected simply in the fact that there is no VAT line, that we effectively have VAT, which is about 7% of GDP, and you do not, and that's just a straight policy choice. Actually, the basic structure of the collection of tax, of tax policy, is not that out of line. And by and large, when you go around the developed world, not the developing world, you will see that the structure looks much like that. And I sort of leave on one side the long and interesting debate about whether VAT, which is one of the most economically efficient taxes there is, is actually a better tax than some of the ones you've got. And indeed, our VAT is not as optimal. So when you look at that, and so I just try and keep that in your mind, what you see the choices are that have been made. And, we do go back to William Pitt, and, you've got to thank Napoleon for a lot of things, but, forcing us to invent income tax and introduce it is definitely one of them. There is a huge reliance of taxes on personal income. Sorry, and I'm just going to go back to the previous slide, because the other thing you just note about the previous slide is that while personal income tax and social security in both of our countries represents about 15% of GDP, corporate income tax represents under 3% of GDP, and actually as a proportion of revenues across the OECD, corporate income tax represents about that sort of percentage, roughly 7% or 6 or 7% of tax receipts. So corporate income tax, which by and large is the meat and drink of international tax, looks like a relatively unimportant element of overall revenues. And that when you're looking at policy, and if you were a policy maker, if you were told, well, the challenges of international tax are all about how corporations are taxed, you say, well, yeah, but we get all our money from personal income, so we shouldn't worry about that too much. And that comes back to this slide. Where are we? And while there are some generalizations here, they're generalizations which are quite significant in terms of what's going on in the world. Reliance of taxes on personal income. Corporate income tax as an essential backstop to income tax, but only, as I say, a relatively small proportion of receipts. Income is taxed territorially, and this is a really important point, with very little differentiation between tax on income, labour income, and tax on capital income. And property and consumption taxes are still significant, although that varies around the world. So that's the structure of tax policies around the world as we stand today. In terms of my opening question, which is, this is apocalyptic times, you might stop and say, well, no, because none of the forces which I've really talked about are going to have much income on personal income taxes. And while we're collecting so much from personal income tax, we don't really need to worry about these issues of technology. We don't need to worry about what's happening to international corporations, because we can go on taxing individuals. And I think that, in a sense, if there's a crux of a point to worry about, it is in that as a fallacy. The joint stock company, which again, I'm sorry, I'm not coming over here to beat a nationalistic drum, but I think the joint stock company was a great British invention in 1842 or something like that. It is a wonderful thing. It's one of those inventions when you ask people what are the great inventions of humankind, very few people would say the joint stock company. And you laugh, but actually what it allowed was for ideas, for capital and labour to be pooled in a single place, and to effectively unleash the forces, Adam Smith's invisible hand, to effectively generate huge amounts of wealth. And like a lot of British inventions, you took it up and used it rather better than we did. The joint stock company in the 19th century was an absolutely massive engine for growth in this country. But precisely because it does bring together in this sort of magical way intellectual property, labour income, and capital, it is, and in a sense all of you, I hope, know this because it's what you are or have studied, it is a puzzle for tax policymakers, simply because those are different things. And so in worrying about what's happening to tax policy, I would start, and in a sense almost finish, with what's happening to corporate income tax, precisely because it is so complex. But, and this is the point which again runs through the theme of confidence, that the failure to tax corporation tax and the importance of taxing the failure to tax corporations and the importance of taxing corporations effectively underpins the whole of the rest of the tax system. And the letters which I used to get as chair of HMRC from individual taxpayers who were being chased for the odd £200 or so, saying, why should I pay my tax? Why are you chasing me when Google is not paying its tax? Demonstrate quite how reliant the overall, the totality of the tax system is on the confidence that the taxpayer has that everyone, and especially the large corporations, who precisely because of the magic of the joint stock company have managed to create such considerable wealth, that they should be paying tax at the same time as the Joe public. And I've listed here some of the challenges, which again, the vulnerabilities, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which globalization and the other forces are having on corporate income tax, creating the multiplicity of transfer pricing events, which is overwhelming tax administrations, quite apart from creating novel situations. The ability of separation of intellectual property from tangible activities and working at a distance, which again has multiplied the opportunities for moving profits into different places. I think really significantly, the extent to which technological change has allowed what are effectively entirely domestic businesses to exploit international rules, which were very much, when David and I were young men, the playground of the genuine multinationals. But you now see significant amount of, as it were, abuse and certainly use of international rules by largely domestic businesses, and with it the inadequacy of all of the existing rules for all the new forms of business income which technology has created. And as I say, the wider loss of confidence in the system which this engenders. Personal income tax I've put second, but as I've said, the failure to tax corporate income effectively risks undermining confidence in the system of personal tax and the willingness of individuals to pay tax themselves, alongside some of the issues that we've seen in the ability to fragment and recharacterise labour income, which is a particular problem in the UK, and the corrosive effect of the disruption of local businesses. Now, I am a user of Uber. I am a user of Airbnb. I'm off to stay in an Airbnb on Friday in Washington. But nevertheless, the fact that these businesses are disrupting local businesses, that the local cab driver is being disrupted by Uber, that the local letting business is being disrupted by Airbnb or whatever it is, itself is disruptive to local communities, which itself undermines the wider confidence in the system if the tax system does not, which it certainly does not in the UK and Europe, and I can't speak for you, adequately and fairly tax these new forms of business. So personal income tax itself is under threat and under challenge from the disruption, in the sense of the economically beneficial disruption which technology is bringing. I won't say much about consumption taxes. I will put a question against property tax, because if there is light at the end of the tunnel, it is that, if it doesn't move, tax it, has always been a good adage, and property is the one thing which it is quite hard to move or conceal. Sort of pushing on, very conscious of time, against my tests, where is my glass on tax policy? We are seeing direct erosion of all revenues from changing business models and from international arbitrage. We are seeing real unfairness of outcomes, simply because of the failure of the tax system to cope with the new forms of business, and just as important, apparent unfairness, the perception that the tax system is not dealing fairly with many of the new forms of business. From that, you can see if we can sustain the personal income tax base, consumption taxes and property taxes are potentially the long-term sustainable basis. And then the $64 billion trillion question is what is going to happen to corporate income tax. it is an essential backstop to all of the other taxes, precisely because you need to tax companies because they bring together so many different forms of income. But it is arguably no longer fit for purpose. I think it was in about 1996 I gave my first time I gave a talk on corporation tax, The Race to the Bottom, and like Mark Twain, rumours of the death of corporation tax, have been greatly exaggerated. And coming back to my opening points about the tensions between law and equity, between law and politics, and national and international taxes, or tax and international activity, is that we do need to make sure that at these times that the purity of the subject which you are studying, of law, is upheld by the recognition for a need of fair behaviour by taxpayers and fair systems by governments. And part of the corrosion and loss of confidence is through the perception that effectively taxpayers too often rely on the law without regard for fairness. Secondly, and related to that, the political base of tax as a legal subject needs to somehow accommodate, and I can't find a better word, what is going out there with popular views, particularly, as I say, on taxing companies and taxing large companies. And I don't have an answer to this. I have no way of taxing the footballist multinationals, but I know that failure to do so is damaging and corrosive. And finally, that in all of this, the supporting national sovereignty, and this is not a plea for nationalism, but it is a recognition that individuals feel insecure if they feel that their national identity is being challenged, that needs to be sustained, and yet it needs to be challenged. It needs to operate within this international context, which is undoubtedly corroding tax systems. So, do I have any conclusions from all of this? Well, I've tried to balance the positive with the less positive. And in a sense, the purpose of this talk is to encourage you to think about these problems. Globalization is creating drivers for greater international coordination and cooperation, and that's good. And as David pointed out, and as I have been involved in, there is a lot of work on the international side at government level, and there are drivers for that which need to be supported. But globalization is also eroding the existing tax concepts of territoriality, the location of activities, and it's making fairness and confidence in the system harder to achieve. Technology is definitely, as a former tax collector, creating new opportunities for tax collection, but it is dispersing and dematerializing taxable events and entities in ways which tax systems are finding increasingly hard to follow. Individualism, which I haven't said much about specifically, may be strengthening national affiliation, and it may be that we can use some of the forces that are out there in order to bolster the strength of the institutions of tax collection we need. But equally, it is weakening the confidence in institutions. And my very final point, it is undoubtedly weakening respect for the rule of law. Tax is based in law, and the rule of law itself is based in confidence. And I think it is all of our responsibility, with all of these fine balances which sustain the system, and in order to maintain the flow of taxes on which all of our societies depend, ourselves to do what we can in what are, I think, fascinating times to support the rule of law. So I very much hope that you will continue to do that in your working and daily lives. Thank you very much.
Well, that gave us a lot to think about. Are there any questions? Anyone want to be brave enough to raise their hand? We have time for a few questions before we call it quits. No? Yes, Odi.
My question is related to the tax gap. So how does the government determine the actual tax liability compared to how much was actually
Yeah.
collected? Is it based on audits or is it based on an estimation of what businesses in different industries should pay, or is it based on the information provided by taxpayers?
I'm very conscious I'm standing between you and a drink. The answer is all of the above, but also the answer is that HMRC publish a regular, not sure whether it's annual or it's certainly out there, on methodologies for calculating the tax gap, and it is a genuinely fascinating subject, and you have to use all of those methods because of the different nature of the different taxes whose tax gap you need to measure. And you know, while we publish 5.7%, actually there are some quite flaky numbers within that, to be honest. There was somebody else there.
So, some of the larger Central and South American countries are doing real pipelines of corporations, and they've got the pipeline right over the computer, and they're looking at the transactions as they go.
Fabulous.
How come the Britain and the United States are doing
I mean, I think it comes back to, in a sense, it goes back to the 18th century and the distrust of government. I think it goes back to the lack of confidence in some of the institutions. I think it goes back to, you know, the relative strength of government against some of the very valid checks and balances which exist in our societies. But that is the question, and if we want to, you know, maintain this system, how do we achieve what some other countries have achieved, but in a way which maintains the confidence and the support of the tax-paying and voting public? I mean, there are lots of good technical answers to that, but it doesn't quite tell you how to do it if you're a tax administrator.
Dan?
Yeah, I was going to say, the interesting to see the 5.7% versus 20% tax gaps, but as someone who knows more about the American side than the UK side, I'd say in our country it's some kind of political choice. Congress doesn't want cash businesses to be hassled, and so I'm kind of interested that, so in a way it's not that even the IRS Commissioner's budget isn't the problem, it's Congress has chosen that they would like that to be the case. So I'm curious why that doesn't happen in the UK.
Well, the answer is it does to a significant extent, and every time we try and do a bit of, actually it's a bit of an answer to the previous question, we've tried to introduce what's called Making Tax Digital for Business, which is sort of moving towards linking their accounting and till system through to HMRC. We get a lot of complaints from business. They're all very politely dressed up. They're all very technological, but actually, I suspect when you dig down, what they're saying is, we're fiddling the books and we don't want you to know about it. So I think there are some very interesting political choices, but there's also a question coming back to my balances is, you know, is it a stable situation whereby effectively you are implicitly or explicitly condoning a degree of tax evasion? I mean, I genuinely don't know. If it keeps your system going, great, but do you feel it's sustainable even if you feel it's right?
Not my choice.
Well, you're a voter, you're a taxpayer. You probably do pay your taxes.
One more question? All right, then, thank you very much.
Okay.
We'll have a brief reception, as we always do at the end of the lecture. Thank you very much. This was extremely interesting, and thank you for coming all this way to tell us the truth. Give us the word.